Section 18 of Astounding Stories 16, April 1931. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by John Williamson. Astounding Stories 16, April 1931, by Various. The Lake of Light, by Jack Williamson. Part 1. In the frozen wastes at the bottom of the world, two explorers find a strange pool of white fire and have a strange adventure. The roar of the motor rang loud in the frosty air above the desert of ice. The sky above us was a deep purple blue. The red sun hung like a crimson eye low in the north. 3,000 feet below, through a hazy blue mist of wind-whipped, frozen vapor, was the rugged wilderness of black ice peaks and blizzard-carved hummocks of snow. A grim, undulating waste, black and yellow, splotched with crystal white. The icy wind howled dismally through the struts. We were flying above the weird ice mountains of the Enderby quadrant of Antarctica. That was a perilous flight, across the blizzard-whipped bottom of the world. In all the years of polar exploration by air, since Bird's memorable flights, this area had never been crossed. The intrepid Britisher, Major Meriden, with the daring American aviatrix whom the world had known as Mildred Cross before she married him, had flown into it 19 years before, and like many others they had never returned. Faintly above the purring drone of the motor, I heard Ray Summers shout. I drew my gaze from the desolate plateau of ice below and leaned forward. His lean, fur-hooded face was turned back toward me. A mittened hand was pointing, and thin lips moved in words that I did not hear above the roar of the engine and the scream of the wind. I turned and looked out to the right, past the shimmering silver disk of the propeller. Under the blue haze of ice crystals in the air, the ice lay away in a vast undulating plain of black and yellow, broken with splotches of prismatic whiteness, lying away in frozen desolation to the rim of the cold violet sky. Rising against that sky, I saw a curious thing. It was a mountain of fire. Beyond the desert of ice, a great conical peak pointed straight into the amethystine gloom of the polar heavens. It was brilliantly white, a finger of milky fire, a sharp cone of pure light. It shone with white radiance. It was brighter, far brighter than is the sacred cone of Fujiyama in the vivid day of Japan. For many minutes I stared in wonder at it. Far away it was. It looked very small. It was like a little heap of light poured from the hand of a fire god. What might it be I could not imagine. At first sight I imagined it might be a volcano with streams of incandescent lava flowing down the side. I knew that this continent of mystery boasted Mount Erebus and other active craters, but there was none of the smoke or lurid yellow flame which accompanies volcanic eruptions. I was still watching it and wondering when the catastrophe took place. The catastrophe which hurled us into a mad extravaganza of amazing adventure. Our little two-place amphibian was flying smoothly, through air unusually good for this continent of storms. The 12 cylinders of the motor had been firing regularly since we took off from Bird's old station at Little America 15 hours before. We had crossed the pole in safety. It looked as if we might succeed in this attempt to penetrate the last white spot on the map. Then it happened. A sudden crack of snapping metal rang out sharp as a pistol report. A bright blade of metal flashed past the wing struts to fall in a flashing arc. The motor broke abruptly into a mad, deep-voiced roar. Terrific vibration shook the ship until I feared it would go to pieces. Ray Summers, with his usual quick efficiency, cut the throttle. Quickly the motor slowed to idling speed. The vibration stopped. A last cough of the engine, and there was no sound save the shrill screaming of the wind in the gloomy twilight of this unknown land beyond the pole. "What in the devil?" I exclaimed. "The prop! See?" Ray pointed ahead. I looked, and the dreadful truth flashed upon me. The steel propeller was gone, or half of it at least. One blade was broken off at a jagged line just above the hub. "The propeller! What made it break? I've never heard—" "Search me!" Ray grinned. "The important thing is that it did. It was all metal, of course, tested and guaranteed. The guarantee isn't worth much here. A flaw in the forging, perhaps, that escaped detection. And this low temperature makes metal as brittle as glass, and the thing may have been crystallized by the vibration." The plane was coming down in a shallow glide. I looked out at the grim expanse of black ice crags and glistening snow below us, and it was far from a comforting prospect. But I had a huge amount of confidence in Ray Summers. I have known him since the day he appeared from his father's great Arizona ranch to be a freshman in the School of Mines at El Paso, where I was then an instructor in geology. We have knocked about queer corners of the world together for a good many years. But he is still a good boy, with bluff, simple manners of the West. "Do you think we can land?" I asked. "Looks like we got to," he said grimly. "And what after that?" "How should I know? We have the sledge, tent, furs, food and fuel for the Primus to last a week. There's the rifle, but it must be 1,000 miles to anything to shoot. We can do our best." "We should have an extra prop." "Of course, but it was so many pounds when every pound counted. And who knew the thing would break?" "We'll never get out on a week's provisions." "Not a shot. Too bad to disappoint Captain Harper." Ray grinned wanly. "He ought to have the Albatross around here by this time, waiting for us." The Albatross was the ship which had left us at Little America a few months before to steam around and pick us up at our destination beyond Enderby Land. "We're in the same boat with Major Meriden and his wife, and all those others. Lost without a trace." "You've read Scott's diary that he wrote after he visited the pole in 1912, the one they found with the bodies?" "Yes. Not altogether cheerful. But we won't be trying to get out. No use of that." He looked at me suddenly, grinning again. "Say, Jim, why not try for that shining mountain we just saw? It looks queer enough to be interesting. We ought to make it in a week." "I'm with you," I said. I did not speak again, for the jagged ice peaks were coming rather near. I held my breath as the little plane veered around a slender black spire and dropped toward a tiny scrap of smooth snow along the ice hummocks. I might have spared my anxiety. Under Ray's consummately skillful piloting, the skids struck the snow with hardly a shock. We glided swiftly over the ice and came to rest just short of a yawning crevice. "Suppose," said Ray, "that we spend the first night in the plane. We are tired already. We can keep warm here and sleep. We've plenty of ice to melt for water. Then we're off for the shining mountain." I agreed. Ray Summers is usually right. We got out of the sledge, packed it, took our bearings, and made all preparations for a start to the luminous mountain, which was about 100 miles away. The thermometer stood at 20 below, but we were comfortable enough in our furs as we ate a scanty supper and went to sleep in the cabin of the plane. We started promptly the next morning after draining the last of the hot chocolate from our vacuum bottles, which we left behind. We had a light but powerful sporting rifle with telescopic sights and several hundred rounds of ammunition. Ray put them in the pack, though I insisted that we would never need them, unless a quick way out of our predicament. "No, Jim," he said. "We take them along. We don't know what we're going to find at the shining mountain." The air was bitterly cold as we set out. It was 25 below and a sharp wind was blowing. Only our toiling at the sledge kept us warm. We covered 18 miles that day and made a good camp in the lee of a bare stone ridge. That night there was a slight fall of snow. When we went on, it was nearly 35 degrees below zero. The layer of fresh snow concealed irregularities in the ice, making our pulling very hard. After an exhausting day, we had made hardly 15 miles. On the following day, the sky was covered with gray clouds, and a bitterly cold wind blew. We should have remained in the tent, but the shortage of food made it imperative that we keep moving. We felt immensely better after a reckless, generous fill of hot pemmican stew, but the next morning my feet were so painful from frostbite that I could hardly get on my fur boots. Walking was very painful to me that day, but we made a good distance, having come to smoother ice. Ray was very kind in caring for me. I became discouraged about going on at all. It was very painful, and I knew there was no hope of getting out. I tried to get some of our morphine tablets, but Ray had them, and refused to be convinced that he ought to go on without me. In the next march we came in sight of a luminous mountain, which cheered me considerably. It was a curious thing indeed. A straight-sided cone of light it was, rather steeper than the average volcano. Its point was sharp, its sides smooth as if cut with a mammoth plane, and it shone with a pure white light, with a steady and unchanging milky radiance. It rose out of the black, dull yellow of the ice wilderness like a white finger of hope. The next morning it was a little warmer. Ray had been caring for my feet very attentively, but it took me nearly 2 hours to get on my footgear. Again I tried to get him to leave me, but he refused. We arrived at the base of the shining mountain in 3 more marches. On the last night, the fuel for the Primus was all gone, having been used up during the very cold weather, and we were unable to melt water to drink. We munched the last of our pemmican dry. A few minutes after we had started on the last morning, Ray stopped suddenly. "Look at that!" he cried. I saw what he had seen, the wreck of an airplane, the wings crumpled up and blackened with fire. We limped up to it. "A Harley biplane!" Ray exclaimed. "That is Major Meriden ship, and look at that wing. It looks like it's been in an electric furnace." I examined the metal wing, saw that it had been blackened with heat. The metal was fused and twisted. "I've seen a good many wrecks, Jim. I've seen planes that burned as they fell, but nothing like that. The fuselage and engines were not even afire, Jim. Something struck out from that shining mountain and brought them down." "Are they—" I began. Ray was poking about in the snow in the cockpits. "No, not here. Probably should have been better for them if they had been killed in the plane. quick and merciful." He examined the engines and propellers. "No, seems to be nothing wrong. Something struck 'em down." Soon we went on. The shining mountain rose before us like a great cone of fire. It must have been 3,000 feet high, and about that in diameter at the bottom. Its walls were as smooth and straight as though turned from milky rock crystal in a gigantic lathe. It shone with a steady, brilliantly white radiance. "That's no natural hill," Ray grunted beside me as we limped on. We were less than a mile from the foot of the cone of fire. Soon we observed another remarkable thing about it. It seemed that a straight band of silvery metal rose from the snow about its foot. "Has it a wall around it?" I exclaimed. "Evidently," said Ray. "Looks as if it's built on a round metal platform. But by whom? When? Why?" We approached the curious wall. It was of a white metal, apparently aluminum, or a silvery alloy of that metal. In places it was 25 feet high, but more usually the snow and ice was banked high against it. The smooth white wall of the gleaming mountain stood several hundred yards back from the wall. "Let's have a look over it," Ray suggested. "We can get up on that hummock against it. You know, this place must have been built by men." We clambered up over the ice, as he suggested, until our heads came above the top of the wall. "A lake of fire!" cried Ray. Indeed, a lake of liquid fire lay before us. The white aluminum wall was hardly a foot thick. It formed a great circular tank, nearly a mile across, with the cone of white fire rising in the center, and the tank was filled to within a foot of the top with shimmeringly brilliant white fluid, bright and luminous as the cone. Liquid light. Ray dipped a hand into it. The hand came up with fingers of fire, radiant, gleaming, with shining drops falling from them. With a spasmodic effort he flung off the luminous drops, rubbed his hands on his garments, and got back into its fur mitten. "Gee, it's cold," he muttered. "Freeze the horns off a brass billy goat." "Cold light," I exclaimed. "What wouldn't a bottle of that stuff be worth to a chemist back in the States?" "That cone must be a factory to make the stuff," Ray suggested, hugging his hand. "They might pump the liquid up to the top and then let it trickle down over the sides. That would explain why the cone is so bright. The stuff might absorb sunlight like barium sulfide. And there could be chemical action with the air under the actinic rays." "Well, if somebody's making cold light, where does he use it?" "I'd like to find out and strike him for a hot meal," Ray said, grinning. "It's too cold to live on top of the ground around here. They must run it down in a cave." "Then let's find the hole." "You know, it's possible we won't be welcome. This mountain of light may be connected with the vanishing of all the aviators. We'd better take along the rifle." We set off around just outside the white metal wall. The snow and ice was irregularly banked against it, but the wall itself was smooth and unbroken. We had limped along for some 2 miles, or more than halfway around the amazing lake of light. I had begun to doubt that we would find anything. Then we came to a square metal tower, 10 feet on a side, that rose just outside the silvery wall, up to a level with its top. The ice was low here. The tower rose 20 feet above its unequal surface. We found metal flanges riveted to its side, like the steps of a ladder. They were most inconveniently placed, nearly 4 feet apart, but we were able to climb them and look down into the shaft. It was a straight-sided pit, evidently some hundreds of feet deep. We could see a tiny square of light at the bottom, very far away. The flanges ran down the side, forming the rungs of a ladder that gave access to whatever lay at the bottom. Without hesitation, Ray climbed over the side and started down. I followed him, feeling a great relief in getting out of the freezing wind. Ray had the rifle and ammunition strapped to his back, along with a few other articles, and I had a small pack. We had abandoned the sledge with the useless stove and most of our instruments. Our food was all gone. The metal flanges were fully 4 feet apart, and it was not easy to scramble down from one to another. Certainly not easy for one who was cold, hungry, thirsty, worn out with a week of exhausting marches, and suffering the torture of frozen feet.
"You know, this thing was not built by man," Ray observed.
"Not built by men? What do you mean?"
"Men would have put the steps closer together, Jim. I'm afraid we're up against something, well, that we aren't used to."
"If men didn't build this, what did?" I was astounded.
"Search me. This continent has been cut off from the rest of the world for geologic ages. Such life as has been found here is not common to the rest of the earth. It is not impossible that some form of life, isolated here, has developed intelligence and acquired the power to erect that cone of light and to burn the wing off a metal airplane."
My thoughts whirled madly as we clambered down the shaft. It must have taken us an hour to reach the bottom. I did not count the steps, but it must have been at least 1,000 feet. The air grew rapidly warmer as we descended. We both took off most of our heavy fur garments and left them hanging on the rungs. I was rather nervous. I felt the nearness of an intelligent, hostile power. I had a great fear that the owners of those steps would use them to find us, and then crush us ruthlessly as they had brought down Meriden plane. The little square of white light below grew larger. Finally, I saw Ray swing off and stand on his feet in a flood of white radiance below me. The air was warm, moist, laden with a subtle, unfamiliar fragrance that suggested growing things. Then I stood beside Ray. We stood on the bare stone floor of a huge cavern. It must have been of volcanic origin. The walls glistened with the sparkling smoothness of a volcanic glass. It was a huge space. The black roof was 100 feet high or more. The cave was some hundreds of feet wide, and it sloped away from us into dim distance, as though leading into huger cavities below. The light that shone upon us came from an amazing thing, a fall of liquid fire. From the roof plunged a sheer torrent of white, brilliantly luminous fluid, falling 100 feet into a shimmering pool of moon flame. Shining opalescent mists swirled about it, and the ceaseless roar of it filled the cave with sound. It seemed that a stream of the phosphorescent stuff ran down the cave from the pool to light the lower caverns.
"Very clever," said Ray. "They make the stuff up there at the cone and run it in here to see by."
"This warm air feels mighty good," I remarked, pulling off another garment. Ray sniffed the air.
"Curious odor. Smells like something growing. Where anything is growing, there ought to be something to eat. Let's see what we can find."
Only black obsidian covered the floor about us. Cautiously, we skirted the overflowing pool of white fire and followed down the stream of it that flowed toward the inner cavern. We had gone but a few hundred yards when suddenly Ray stopped me with a hand on my arm.
"Lie flat," he hissed. "Quick!"
He dived behind a huge mass of fire-born granite. I flung myself down beside him.
Something is coming up the trail by the shining river. And it isn't a man. It's between us and the light. We should be able to see it.
Soon I heard a curious scraping sound and a little tinkle of metal. I caught a whiff of a powerful odor, a strange, fishy odor, so strong that it almost knocked me down. The thing that made the scraping and the tinkle and the smell came into view. The sight of it sickened me with horror. For it was larger than a man. Its body was heavy as a horse's, but nearer the ground. In form it suggested a huge crab, though it was not very much like any crustacean I had ever seen. It was mostly red in color and covered with a huge scarlet shell. It had 5 pairs of limbs. The 2 forward pairs had pincers, seemingly used as hands. It scraped along on the other 3 pairs. Yard-long antennae, slender and luminously green, wavered above a grotesque head. The many facets of compound eyes stood on the end of foot-long stalks. The amazing crab thing wore a metal harness. Bands of silvery aluminum were fastened about its shell, with little cases of white metal dangling to them. In one of its uplifted claws it carried what seemed to be an aluminum bar, 2 feet long and an inch thick. It scraped lumberingly past, between us and the racing stream of white fire. It passed less than a dozen feet from us. The curious fishy smell of it was overpowering, disgusting. Sweat of horror chilled my limbs. The monster emanated power, sinister, malevolent power, power intelligent, alien, and hostile to man. I trembled with the fear that it would see us, but it scrambled grotesquely on. When it was 20 yards past, Ray picked up a block of black lava that lay beneath his hand and hurled it silently and swiftly. It crashed splinteringly on the rocks far beyond the creature, on the other side of the stream of light. In fascination I watched the monster as it paused, as if astonished. The glittering compound eyes twisted about on their stalks, and the long shining green tentacles wavered questioningly. Then the knobbed limbs snapped the white metal tube to a level position. A metallic click came from it, and a ray of red light, vivid and intense, burst from the tube. It flashed across the river of fire. With a dull, thudding burst, it struck the rocks where the stone had fallen. It must have been a ray of concentrated heat. Rocks beneath it flashed into sudden incandescence, splintered and cracked, flowed in molten streams. End of part 1.